Well, actually, I came to do what I'm doing by a very circuitous route. I grew up on a farm in Iowa, in a household where there weren't very many books, and so the idea of becoming a writer was entirely foreign growing up. And I remember being influenced early on in grade school by poets like Edgar Allan Poe, The Raven, books like that, poems like that in school. But it never had occurred to me that being a writer was something that a person could do. And so I graduated and went to college and actually had written some what I would call ditties or verse in high school, but wouldn't really call them poems. And it was in college really when I became a poet, and I actually have a piece that I've written about what I consider the first poem, and I'll read just a little bit of that if I may, not the whole essay, but part of it. The title of the piece, and it appeared, by the way, in the Poetry City USA Volume 2, which is one of the volumes that came out of the Great Twin Cities Poetry Read, which was edited and curated by the inimitable Matt Mauch in the day. It's passed on to someone else now, but this piece is called Two Roberts and a Picasso, or How I Became a Poet. And I'll just read the first part of it. One by one we enter the classroom, girls in skirts and boys in slacks and shirt with collar as required by college dress code. At the entrance, just inside the door, stands the professor, wearing his tweed suit and tie, his shoes polished to a high shine. As each student files by, he greets us. Good morning, Mr. Smith. Good morning, Miss Peterson. As I walk by this particular late fall Monday, he breaks tradition and says, "Now, wasn't that fun?" Excruciatingly shy in my first semester at a small liberal arts college in the middle of Iowa, I feel my face burn and am unable to utter even the obligatory, "Good morning, Dr. Kildall." I do, however, know without a doubt that what he refers to, my first real attempt at writing a poem. Truth be told, I hadn't meant to write a poem, and wouldn't have dared to call it that at the time. In looking back, I see that's what it was, though it's just as well I don't have it to read now. I'm sure my current critical eye would judge it a poor specimen. At the time, however, I felt a secret joy welling up between shyness and relief. I hadn't, after all, failed the week's assignment. I was enrolled in an interdisciplinary honors class, combining the study of art, literature, and philosophy. Every week, we were required to write what Dr. Kildall called a reaction paper, a 5-page or so essay responding to lectures, reading assignments, and discussions. The handwritten essays were always due in Friday morning's class. This meant that every Thursday night I'd be up after the 10 o'clock curfew, and usually after my roommates and I had returned from our regular jaunt to the student union for the Sunday we fondly called a brownie goop, its hot fudge melting a trail through vanilla ice cream and down to a gooey brownie layer at bottom. Each Thursday all semester long, I'd faithfully written the essay and turned it in on time. But on that one particular Thursday evening, I was simply not in the mood to do the week's homework. Instead, my gaze lingered on a poster hanging in my dorm room. I responded to it in short sentences and brief descriptive phrases with line breaks. The poster was Picasso's Old Guitarist. The previous summer, after my 1967 high school graduation, I had worked in Chicago as a nanny. My farm upbringing among numerous younger siblings, nephews, and neighbor kids in need of babysitters made me well qualified in the eyes of my new employers to care for an 18-month-old boy. To me, it meant a chance to get off the farm and into the city to experience culture and the arts. Each week I had one day off. On every one of them, I took the bus to the L and rode downtown to the Art Institute. In addition to the Institute's remarkable collection of Impressionist art, which I would learn about the following fall in Kildall's class, and a Surrealism exhibition, it also happened that the Institute was showing a retrospective of Pablo Picasso's work. Every week I wandered among the galleries, pacing myself to savor the art, to take it in bit by bit. Then, one day, I turned the corner into a small gallery showing work from Picasso's Blue Period. There in the center of the longest wall hung Picasso's Old Guitarist, painted in 1903. I was transfixed. Though there were other paintings from the period in the room, I saw none of them. I was deeply moved by the guitarist's blue crossed legs, the angle of his shoulder and neck, his languid fingers over the sound hole of the guitar, the clasp of the guitarist's other hand high up on the fretboard in the shadows. My feet seemed to sink through the marble floor. For the rest of the summer, I spent time each week in Picasso's Blue Period room with the old guitarist. I knew the poster in the gift shop could not truly replicate the way the brushstrokes in the painting reflected light or captured the shifts in value among the blues and greens, yet I had to have it. I bought the print to hang in my dorm room come fall. It was The Old Guitarist who became the subject of my failed essay assignment in Dr. Kildall's class, and my first poem. His simple remark, "Now, wasn't that fun?" as well as the A on the paper when he handed it back, affirmed for me that whatever it was I'd done, it had value. So that is at least a large part of the answer to how I came to be doing what I'm doing. From there, I just started writing poems and really just scribbling them in notebooks and not really sharing them with very many people for many, many years. I had a few published in small literary magazines on campus, various campuses where I went to school. It wasn't actually until graduate school that I officially sort of claimed the label poet, because I had to declare. In those days in graduate school in creative writing, you had to declare either fiction or poetry. There was no creative nonfiction. And I declared as a poet. My undergraduate work was actually in philosophy, and I undertook that at Sonoma State University, and eventually ended up at Colorado State University for my graduate work. So there I really focused, and the program focused on modern poets, especially. So I got to learn, of course, about that poetry didn't have to rhyme, which I didn't learn from school, although in that period in between when I was discovering poetry on my own and trying to teach myself about poetry, I don't even remember how I came upon Robert Duncan. But I spent a lot of time reading Robert Duncan and read him over and over again, even though I couldn't understand a word of what he was saying in those poems. But I became enamored of his language and just the sound of it and the exploration of concepts and ideas that he was doing. So, of course, one doesn't make a great living as a poet, so I had to earn money, and I taught in graduate school. I did also have excellent training in how to teach composition, so for many years here in Minnesota, in Minneapolis, I taught English composition, creative writing, poetry lit classes, and in the women's studies program, as well as in the Veterans Upward Bound program. But I taught a lot of comp and as much poetry as I could for many years. I've more recently retired from that full-time position and am continuing to teach at the Loft Literary Center. I first taught at the Loft, I think, in something like 1986, and taught there on and off over the years, and now that I'm retired from the full-time 5 courses per semester, I'm teaching more at the Loft and doing other kinds of teaching artist freelance gigs around wherever I can get them with different populations. I'm actually very interested in working with elders in poetry. There is, as some of you may know, there is an organization called the Alzheimer's Poetry Project that is doing poetry with elders who have memory loss and are in facilities or not, in early stages of Alzheimer's, using poetry to engage their minds and memories to whatever degree is possible. I'm hoping to do some of that work. In fact, it reminds me that when I first moved to the Twin Cities, which was after graduate school in 1984, I wanted then to work with elders, and I contacted the Wilder Foundation and said that I would volunteer to do some workshops with their population, and they had a day program then. And they said, great, you want to do poetry? We want to be sure and include Evelyn. And I'm sort of making up her name because I'm not sure if that is actually her name, but I'm not sure of my memory on her name. But I was a little nervous about including Evelyn because, as they explained, she had Alzheimer's. And at that time, I knew very little about Alzheimer's. And most people knew far less about Alzheimer's than we do now. But I was fearful because I was afraid she might wander. And I was fearful of what my responsibility would be, and I didn't want that to happen on my watch. As it turned out, she was incredible. The minute I said the word poem or poetry, she began to recite these whole poems by Oliver Wendell Holmes, James Russell Lowell, Longfellow, of course, entire poems, not just snippets of poems. And it turned out that when she was growing up, her grandmother had lived with her, and the whole family, and she and her grandmother would memorize poems and recite them to each other. So though she had no present-day memory, her long-term memory was chock full of poems, which was very inspiring for me. So I spent a period of time after that memorizing poems, thinking, I want to fill my brain with poetry. I'm not sure that I succeeded, certainly not as well as Evelyn did, but...
It's a great story.
Any questions?
Oh yeah, well, I'm just thinking of how oddly parallel our lives are. I mean, I might well have been in Chicago on one of the days that you were in the Institute. I might actually have run into you. I mean, would have been about the right time. I'm not sure whether we went to the Institute or the Historical Museum. I know that we spent, but but again, I was from a little farm. I would have killed for a chance to live in Chicago and spend a day a week, going to the museums. It was the thing I most wanted to do, but I didn't have any skill as a nanny. The child would not have survived with me as a nanny. So I was limited to a trip I took to actually watch a friend take preliminary vows in a religious order. And of course, the city of Chicago, after the city of Forest City, population 100.
Forest City, Iowa?
Minnesota.
Oh, Forest City, Minnesota.
Much, but was kind of a shock. Was Chicago your first big city?
It was. It was. I was in Chicago before I was in Minneapolis, as it turned out.
And what was it like for someone from rural Iowa to encounter Chicago?
It was fairly overwhelming. I think my first experience was actually our senior trip, and on the senior trip we visited the Art Institute, the Field Museum, of course, and we went to some performances, one of which was La Bohème, and I had never heard an opera before, nor had I heard a symphony orchestra performance. And I remember they were playing Wagner's Tristan und Isolde, and we were way, way up in the back, in the far, far seats, literally the nosebleed seats. But they played the overture to Wagner's Tristan und Isolde, and I just had tears coming down my face. I had never heard an orchestra before, and at the break, I was looking around. I was really actually very embarrassed that I was so deeply moved. I was trying to ascertain whether other people had been as moved as I was, and it was, I was very shy, as I mentioned in here. So it was difficult to show my feelings that much, but that was a pretty remarkable experience. Yeah, Chicago, which actually it was the senior trip that made me want to go back. And that's how I happened to apply for the nanny position.
So the other thing that I noticed immediately is that our preparation is going to be in some way similar. I mean, the poems. I mean, I did graduate in '69. So the ways one encounters poetry in high school would have been pretty similar.
Yeah. Do you remember Poe's The Bells?
Oh yes,
the bells,
yes,
bells, and then
Now,
and of course Annabelle Lee, the Raven, of course, but
yeah. Now my way into poetry in Litchfield in central Minnesota was through the the kind of oral recitation contests and things, and so that gave me an opportunity to engage with a particular poem. I think other people had access to literature in a real way through like plays too, but I take it that was not part of your way of getting into.
Well, I did some theater in high school, but I was really fortunate to have a sophomore English teacher who kind of exploded the world for me. Her name was Mrs. Gillis, and in those days they tracked us, so I was in the college prep track, and she had us reading Greek literature. I did a paper on Aeschylus, on the trilogy, the Agamemnon trilogy, and compared it with Morning Becomes with Eugene O'Neill's Morning Becomes Electra. I did that in high school as a sophomore. And she also introduced us to Plato's dialogues. That influenced me hugely, because actually philosophy is what I got my undergraduate degree in. I fell in love with philosophy. And I did write a few poems for that class, but they were some things about spring and quatrains, ABAB kind of rhyme scheme. But they were really ditties, actually. But she was a remarkable teacher, and I'm grateful to her, and I'm really grateful that she made us work so hard. We read things way, way beyond our capability, which pushed our capability to that level. And so she opened the world of both philosophy and literature to me.
Yeah, I have someone similar actually. The person who endowed the show to a certain extent was a teacher of mine as a junior in high school. And it's a similar different kind of thing. She couldn't do anything for a class, but she found a couple of people she could talk to, and was able to do quite a lot for us.
Makes a big difference. And then I had Dr. Kildall, and he made a huge difference too. And I remember, I remember a moment when I actually figured out the difference between reading a text as a philosophy student, a student of philosophy or philosopher, and reading it as a student of literature. Because I was so immersed in philosophy in my undergraduate work, and we were picking apart the arguments and trying to really understand the flow of the arguments and raise challenges to the argument all along the way. And it had to be in Dr. Kildall's class when I realized that some people were talking about the dialogues by asking questions like, why did Plato choose to write in this form? Why are they dialogues? What's the advantage of that literary form? Whereas most of the time I was focusing on, well, what is he saying about, say, love or, the perfect state or, in the Republic or whatever. So that kind of opened up my mind yet again. I was like, well, there's a whole other way to approach the written word, and the different sets of questions to ask. So that was an aha moment.
Yeah. Well, that's that difference in those two ways of reading have been probably the most important thing I've worked with all my life, really. I discovered the possibility of reading the dialogues as literary texts a little later than you did, I think. Once I got it straight that one could take those two approaches, it became kind of an obsession to try to see how they fit together, or how what you learned from one affected what you learned from another. So, what was important for you in philosophy, or how was philosophy important to you in those early days?
Actually, because of Mrs. Gillis, I had wanted to study philosophy. But when I first went into college, I was very firmly informed that I wasn't going to be able to make a living studying philosophy. So I initially chose a more practical major. I was going to study social work or something like that. What was important to me was asking questions, the legitimate asking of questions. Being encouraged to ask questions and to follow the through line. As you know, growing up in a rural background or small town or farm, practicality is numero uno. I mean, it's like you have to survive. And that's all about whatever work you do, raising families for most people, putting food on the table, all that stuff. So I was raised actually on a small family farm in the waning days, as it turns out, of the small farm rural culture. And in fact, my third collection of poems focuses on that. It's called Dodge and Scramble. And it actually asks questions, although poetically, addresses questions about the demise, as it turns out, of rural culture. And the central symbol or emblem of that is the barn, and the iconic barn and its disappearance from our culture. So as it turns out, in this collection, the center section is a sequence of poems written in the voice of a barn. So the barn actually tells its story. So the barn on a family farm in the Midwest, or I suppose just about anywhere, but not only houses and shelters animals and stores grain, but also is a collection of stories of the culture, the stories of the farm family life. So, shall I read?
Yeah, please. I know about barns.
I bet. This one, of course. So remember, the voice is the barn speaking, the barn telling its story. So the title of this one is Iron Oxide. I have always been red, joining green to blue at the horizon, essential as an axle, turning the farm through time. Sky looms in the place where I stood for nearly a century, my shadows stretching from my foundation across the farmyard to the house, then tucking inward, doubling back toward the cattle pens and alfalfa fields, through the soybeans and into corn. I remember the slow layering of shingle over shingle and the setting of the cupola onto the steep roof ridge when I settled into myself. Even before paint, the red so bright they could see me from anywhere, the market, the church. Up to the highest peak, under the rain hood, red. White trim on doors and windows came later. Finally, wheat dust and hay, the smell of cows and swine, a press of hooves, the flat pat of cat paws. Pigeons, too, their voices quavering from the weather vane. Swallows packing mud into homes under eaves, and humans coming and going all day long. Built for storing, painted and repainted, redder than heart, bright as blood. I remember back to pine smell, to boots climbing, the prick of nails, the beat of hammer, the beginnings of shape and story. So that poem essentially introduces this voice of the barn to the readers of the collection.
So, what were your first questions? I mean, philosophically, coming as you were from this place where you're in the middle of a way of life that was slowly dwindling, but you didn't entirely or consciously know it was dwindling. What were you asking about? What did you want to know?
Well, I was really very interested in epistemology, in what can we know, and of course that brings us usually to language, because what we know of the world we know through language, and there I think is the connection between philosophy and poetry for me. I loved reading Wittgenstein, although I also loved reading Heidegger and more than Nietzsche. Yeah, I enjoyed Heidegger a lot. I was asking questions about the nature of being. So I was very interested in ontology as well. But especially language. Because a lot of what we talked about in philosophy, now that I think back on it, was how you ask questions, and what questions can be asked. What kinds of questions are questions that you can pursue toward some kind of answer or resolution. And it's always about framing it in language, and which made me think and continues to make me think about how we would know the world without language. We certainly wouldn't be able to talk about it. And in a lot of ways, my more recent poems are asking similar questions too, but I'm very interested, as obviously in language. I studied some languages. I studied some German in high school and in college a bit. I wanted to study classical Greek, but in those days, so now, by the time I actually went back to college, there was a hiatus for a while, and then I returned to college. By that time I was in California, Sonoma State University. I wanted to study Greek, but there were no classical languages taught there anymore because there weren't enough students interested in studying them. But I did find a teacher. Here again is a teacher. Found a teacher. A few of us. There was a handful of us who wanted to study Greek. And it turned out there was a classicist in the English department. And she was willing to meet with us and tutor us. And actually eventually got approval to teach us a class, a couple semesters of Homeric Greek. Not the classical period, the earlier period, the Homeric period. And that was pretty wonderful. Later, here in Minnesota, I studied American Sign Language. So again, other languages have fed me, and questions about language and the nature of how we express ourselves differently in different languages, and the boundaries around our experience that are defined by language.
One thing that hasn't come into the story yet that was kind of important in this strand of my own was family stuff. What kind of support or attitude did you have from your family as you became an intellectual person and a writer and so forth?
That's actually a loaded question. I mentioned earlier what a practical environment we had. It was no one had been to college, in my family. Dad, in fact, had left school after 8th grade because he needed to help on the farm, and Mom did graduate from high school. And in the days when she was doing her high school education, it was the case that with just a high school education, someone could become a teacher in a country school, which is what she wanted to be. But however, the year she graduated, the law changed so that people would then have to go to what was then called normal school and get a certificate to teach. So she wasn't able to fulfill that dream. And I'll come back to the rest of the question, but this leads me to a little loop I should mention. She therefore wanted me to be a teacher, and I didn't want to be a teacher. I didn't want to be a teacher, primarily, it turns out, probably because she wanted me to be a teacher. And although after the country schoolhouse was closed, and we bought some of those little desks, those old desks with the inkwell, and you sit in them and you put your books underneath, I actually would often, in play, insist that my younger siblings be students, and I would be at the blackboard writing and stuff, and still I thought I didn't want to be a teacher. And then, getting back to Dr. Kildall's class, I had to do a presentation at the end of one of the semesters, and I chose The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock by T.S. Eliot. Did all this research, did the presentation, even had a heckler student whom I managed to handle fairly well. And in Dr. Kildall's evaluation of me, the first thing he said was, Ms. Willow is a natural-born teacher. And I'm like, I didn't want to hear that. Looking back, of course, I'm very pleased that he said that. So I ended up becoming a teacher. But get back to your question about support. Eventually, I have some brothers who went to college, but they went into the military in order to be able to do the GI Bill to fund it, because of course there was no money. I was sort of encouraged and sort of not. I actually got the message quite firmly at some points that why should we spend money on a college education, when you'll just get married and have kids and raise children on a farm. So I had to fight for it. And I got scholarships, which is the only way I could go. And not in addition to scholarships, what were then called National Defense Student Loans. They considered an education part of national defense, for which I'm eternally grateful. So it was because of those programs and work study I was able actually to go. So it wasn't like so much active discouragement, except for a little bit, which I fought through, as just the breaking through the presumption that a college education wasn't really an option, and having to push on through that kind of on my own.
Yeah. I'm thinking of my own situation, wondering if there's any parallel in yours. I mean, we had one, highly educated and rather celebrated person at the edge of the family. It was an outcast. I remember my uncle saying, "There's probably good in Tom, but there's a pile of horse manure over there. There's probably some oats in there, but it's pretty hard to get it out. It's not worth the trouble." And that was pretty much the attitude towards probably one of the finest poets America has produced in the 20th century, Tom McGrath.
Oh, and, Tom McGrath is in your family?
My cousin lived a quarter mile from the home place. And I mean, they were tickled by it too, because he was clearly, this kind of glamorous person, but it was somebody they loved to kind of tear down in the same way. But he was this sort of beacon for all of us that there was a way that, people who started out like us ended up like him when weird things happened.
Wow. I love Thomas McGrath's work. I absolutely adore his poetry. That's really interesting. And of course, he does deal with there's a lot of agricultural imagery in his work. And I want to dwell on this topic for just a little bit, because even though it was hard to kind of work my way into that so educated class, one of the things that I do value, it's like that remark about the pile of manure and looking for the grains of the oats. I appreciate bringing with me from that sort of very working class set of values the skepticism and the questioning of authority. And I get a lot of that not only from the the rural milieu of that distrust of academia, distrust of large bureaucracies, but also from my dad in particular. His saying was often, don't believe anything you read and only half of what you see. And what I learned from that was to be a critical thinker. And that too, I'm sure, led to the philosophy focus. And of course I used it a lot as a teacher, because part of what you're teaching when you're teaching English composition is critical thinking. That's hugely important. So I always had kind of a double relationship with academia, even as an undergraduate as well as a graduate student, and as a teacher, wanting the education, but struggling with the structure and the hierarchy. It was often a struggle.
I've got to ask about Proofrock, which is probably the most important poem in my life as a through string.
Really?
And I hit it a little earlier than you did because my dad was taking a course on television, and of course anything your parents are doing is a big deal to a kid, So I followed along, and so I got that poem early on. It stayed with me. But I know in some ways it puts a hard question to intellectuals, because here's a guy who's basically not going to make it. And he's not going to make it, if you put it into one word, because he's triple and quadruple thinking absolutely everything. And he can't act, and he can't move forward. And in some ways, he's a very much more civilized, the poem's a very much more civilized version of what my uncle was saying about Tom McGrath. Here's a guy who just can't do anything. I'm wondering how you and that poem got along, because I mean it really is one of those things that goes to the question about becoming an educated person, about the whole life of the mind.
The life of the mind, right? That belief that the life of the mind stifles a person from action. That attitude was certainly there growing up, in my family. I think I really learned that attitude, and I couldn't buy it, of course, entirely, or I couldn't go on. Gee, that's a really interesting question. Of course, T.S. Eliot. In some, there's so much of him reflected in that character, in the character of Prufrock. I'd have to think about what you're saying more. There are answers to it. I actually can't think of Eliot and J. Alfred Prufrock and McGrath's work in the same paragraph. I need sort of separate essays for them, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
Because McGrath his work is so grounded. He's very even his rhythms, the rhythms of his language. I feel maybe what I'm starting to touch base with here is that sort of rural-urban difference, because Eliot, though he's from St. Louis, really identified with London.
No, it's and I mean the charm of it for me was that it was this door into all that urban, all that sophisticated stuff, which I wasn't running into any other way.
That's true, and I remember poring for hours and hours over all those references and trying to make sense of it all, and I made some sense, enough sense to be able to present something about the poem, and but I still felt like I hadn't made enough sense of it to satisfy. And of course, one doesn't. You read the poems over and over and over again. Yeah, and maybe I need to reread that poem.
Yeah, it seems to bear rereading.
It does.
It was so fortunate that I was able to recite it, because then it
You could recite the whole thing.
Yeah, I think I still could.
Yeah.
I won't try it right now, but it was that anchored it in a really powerful way. But,
can you recite anything from Thomas McGrath?
Oh yeah, my favorite little bit. Something lights my way through the dark country of the future, like 160 acres of buried owls.
Ooh.
He did this parody of 13 Ways of Looking at a Blackbird, which was basically, a sort of sucker punch on Wallace Stevens, and it was all about owls. And,
but see, there's that difference, the earthiness of McGrath. I mean, because his lines, the longish lines. So, I'm thinking of Letter to an Imaginary Friend, and those lines, some of them, they go on and on. There's so much like soil and wind and wheat and action. There's a lot of action. People are doing a lot of things in McGrath's work.
Yeah, and then there's all this anger, all this good old-fashioned red communist
Righteousness.
anger, which is the thing, of course, my grandparents and relatives were.
Must have been wary of.
Very wary of. I mean, he was the kind of guy the House Un-American Activities Committee was really kind of chasing,
Actually, now might be a really good time for us all to be rereading Thomas McGrath.
So I'm curious. We've happened on Proofrock as a poem you spent time with, but are there other writers or especially poems that have kind of been the through thread for you that you focused on and that were important and that have stayed important for you?
Well, many actually, but I'll mention two in particular, maybe three. When I was in graduate school, we were required to select a major figure to study. And I actually wanted my major figure to be H.D., Hilda Doolittle. But they told me I couldn't do Hilda Doolittle, I couldn't do H.D. because it needed to be a living poet. So I chose Adrienne Rich. Wonderful choices both, right? Can't go wrong with either one. So Adrienne Rich has been a tremendous influence on me. And I remember, of course, for writing my comps, my comprehensive exams, I was supposed to know all of her work, and she had just issued what was the one? I think it was A Wild Patience. A Wild Patience Takes Me This Far, whatever that book had just come out. And I thought, surely, I know. My advisor asked if his wife could borrow my copy of the book. So I said, sure. Okay, so I loaned a copy of the most recent volume of her work out. And then I had to prepare for comps, thinking that they would give me the copy back. I never got it back. And so when I went in for my test, and in those days, we actually, you go into a room and you're given 3 questions. You have 3 hours, an hour for each question, and you write them out. And if you have time, you get them typed up on a Selectric typewriter. And sure enough, the question specifically asked me to follow some image and metaphor trail through and including the most recent volume, which I had not been able to review because I'd loaned my copy to my advisor's wife. So fortunately, I was able to remember enough from the poems that I was able to answer the question, and I did it well, and I passed with high honors and everything. But I was pretty nervous about that. Mm-hmm. But no, Adrienne Rich has meant a huge amount to me. And H.D. Hilda Doolittle's book, in fact, I see it sitting here. We are in Eat My Words wonderful used bookstore in the back room, and the poetry's right over there, and there's a volume of H.D.'s Helen in Egypt. I've been very interested in mythology, and this too I can trace back to Mrs. Gillis in my sophomore year of high school, because she introduced us to Greek mythology and Roman mythology and how the Romans, kind of absorbed and transformed that whole set of mythologies. And it was reading H.D. that made me think about how the imagery of my Catholicism, I was raised Catholic, is a set of mythology. She's not in Helen in Egypt, but in her earlier book in the trilogy, she has a section in, it's either the walls will not fall, a tribute to something, where she has a section about Magdalene, Mary Magdalene, and there's this transformative image of Mary Magdalene in that long poem of hers. And in Helen in Egypt, she actually treats the version of the Helen story that it was not the most popular version. In that version, in the version that she treats, Helen actually wasn't in Troy. When the Greeks get to Troy, in the traditional version, she's behind the walls, and the whole thing is about getting her back for Menelaus. But in the version that this long poem, Helen in Egypt by H.D., follows, Helen is actually spirited away to Egypt, and she's kind of in hiding, and there's kind of a, well, you know how the gods could do anything. They would leave behind what we would now call a hologram of Helen on the ramparts for the Greeks to see, to inspire them, and so on and so on. So, of course, I was first introduced to HD because I was fascinated by the moderns, and some of that can be traced back again to my attempts to read and understand Robert Duncan, and then being introduced to Ezra Pound, HD, and all the moderns. And she was considered by many the ultimate imagist poet because her early poems were very short, very sharp poems with these lovely images, and like one poem for one image, and they would just kind of flare up brightly in your mind. But then eventually she went on to write much, much longer poems, as did most of the moderns, actually, or many of them anyway. So that answers your question about a few of them. Mm-hmm. Another of the moderns who has influenced me a fair amount is Mina Loy, whereas H.D., Ezra Pound, T.S. Eliot were born here. H.D. was born in Pennsylvania. Eliot, of course, in St. Louis. Ezra Pound also, I think, Pennsylvania, because they knew each other as undergraduates. They all sort of started here and went to London. Mina Loy was the opposite story. She was born in London and lived actually all over the continent between the wars. She was sometimes in Paris and sometimes in Italy and sometimes in New York and just sort of all over. But she was considered a modern poet, but she was also an artist. And her work is very little known, although I think that she's coming back to people's attention now. And she was an artist who did work in collage and assemblage, when collage and assemblage were new. She was involved with many of the Surrealist poets. At one time, she was sort of an agent. Her son-in-law, by this time her children had grown up, and one of her daughters was married to, can't think of his name right now, Levy, who was bringing the Surrealists to the attention of the New York art audience. And Mina Loy at that time was in Paris, and she was making connections for Levy with Surrealist artists so that they could sell Surrealist work to him in New York, and they could get it out to people. So she knew people like Marcel Duchamp. She was actually at one time in a play in the Provincetown Theater with William Carlos Williams. The play was called Lima Beans. And so recently I've been taking classes at Minnesota Center for Book Arts and learning to make books. And I just recently completed a book, an accordion book, about Mina Loy called Collage for Mina Loy. It's actually, it's about this size. I'm showing the camera. So it's something like 6 by 9. It's like 14 pages. Each page is a collage and a collage cover and back to honor her and her work as poet, as feminist, and as an artist working in these fields of collage and assemblage. She also did some marvelous drawings and gouaches. So,
isn't it exciting to discover somebody, I mean, who is at least not in the spotlight, even if they're, of course, known?
Mm-hmm. And well, I'm hoping, though, that she'll get a little bit more back in the spotlight. I would really love it if a curator, say someone from the Walker, were to curate an exhibit of her work, of her paintings and collages, and kind of see them all together. And I don't know that that's actually been done. There are pieces in a few collections, but most of them I think are in private collections, what they remain.
Well, I hope that someone's watching.
I hope so too. Yeah, I'm putting the challenge out there to art historians and curators. Consider Mina Loy.
Okay. Well, I notice, you have a little pile of books with you, and I'm just wondering if, we have, 9 minutes or so. I'm wondering if you could read a little bit of what you brought with.
Sure.
That might be, indicative of what kind of stuff you do.
I'm going to read this poem from my first collection, Between, for Scott, who owns this store. Because I'm sure he's had this experience where, and many of our viewers have had this experience too, I'm sure. When you pick up a book that may have been a book that you've owned yourself for a long time and you haven't looked at it for a while, you pick it up and something falls out. Or you're browsing in a bookstore like this one and you find an old book and there's something in it, you know, like a piece of paper or something. This poem is called Letter from the Book. I've been waiting between deckle-edged pages, here with dust and spiders, for this opening, this slow circling of fingers over grain, for your pause on letters that kiss paper as glaciers kissed the earth's skin. Before you read, try this lake sand smell, beaches baked in sun, the sharpness of ink rising like reeds at the edge. Now, let eyes tumble this moraine of words, fall line to line, a caress, fierce and tender as light, seizing the flanks of mountains. After the last word, hold me 3 heartbeats time. Then return me to the shelf. Remember, please, this note. Tuck it between pages. Any two, your choice. So that's for Scott, and for all of you who love books and finding things in books. I also have a collection of poems entitled Silk, which is a series of poems responding to the postures in the Tai Chi Chuan form. I've been practicing Tai Chi for many years, and this is from like the Yang style Tai Chi Chuan form. I was reading a book called How to Grasp the Sparrow's Tail If You Don't Know Chinese, and that book is written by Jane Shore with beautiful calligraphy by Margaret Chang. And Margaret Chang's calligraphy captures the classical caricatures, the classical characters in the Chinese language, and those characters, because they're ideograms, capture the ideas and metaphor, and those ideas and metaphor are chosen as names for various postures in the Tai Chi form, and they all have these amazingly remarkable affinities, let's say, between the images and the movements and the concepts, the metaphors. I did this series of poems, and I chose to do them as tanka because I felt like I needed. Since the Tai Chi form is a very set form, as we practice it, it's the form from the Yang family. My Sifu's teacher was Master Titi Liang, and he studied with Professor Chen Manqing. So the tradition goes back. So there's a set form, as people know, and I'll read just a couple of them. I was thinking that what I might do is read the one called Beginning Posture. And remember, these are tanka, so these are 31 syllable forms, Japanese form, but beginning posture. To begin, I first do nothing. Then, like a tree, I wait, while above and below both reach through me. I become mover and moved. And since this is the year of the monkey, the year of the fire monkey, and the monkey being very much a mischievous figure, a trickster kind of figure, there are a couple postures that are related or have monkey imagery in them. One is called Repulse Monkey. I'll read that one. So in my practice, one of my biggest challenges, it's a physical practice, and it's a spiritual practice, a meditative practice. For me, the mental challenge is often huge, to keep my mind focused and in the moment of each posture and not wander. And so the long posture can be, as we practice it, at a medium rate, anywhere from, say, 7 to 13, to many more minutes if you go very, very slowly. So the goal is to have the mind as focused as possible so that it doesn't wander. Well, my mind wanders a lot, and we often call it monkey mind when we get distracted by something. That's an expression that we use. There is the posture called repulsed monkey actually does have martial art applications, but in this case I think of it as an application for mind focus as well. Repulsed monkey. Mirthful distractor, monkey taunts my clever mind. I reverse myself to unwind accomplishments. Unseen, I achieve my goal. And monkey also appears, where's the other one? Monkey appears in Needle at Sea Bottom, or a reference to monkey. Needle at Sea Bottom. The strongest weapon is small as monkey's needle tucked behind his ear. Mind intent, like his magic, probes to the bottom of things. There's that philosophy again. So those are a few poems from the Tai Chi sequence. I think I'll close, though, with something new, some of my new work. This gets back to language. I've become fascinated by expressions. These expressions, we have many of them in our language, adverbial expressions. And this all started partly because I used to have a studio in the C&E building over in St. Paul on University in Raymond, and I had to park behind the building, and there was an old corrugated metal building behind that housed studios where rock bands used to rehearse. A graffiti, I hesitate to say artist because this was not artfully done, but they had painted oddly enough on this corrugated metal wall where I parked my car, and it just kept coming back to me, so I wrote this poem. Oddly enough, what rises to the surface when the mind idles are words, musical shapings of time and space, units of magic lining a path from capital to period, small bits of breath. Mm-hmm. So I've been following the poems, and the poems are taking me in by way of these kinds of adverbial expressions. And they're interesting to me because in all the languages I've studied, the few languages I've studied, to become fluent, I've found that one of the hardest parts to master are these little adverbial expressions, because they offer these shades of meaning and texture to a language. And this is true for American Sign Language as well, because in American Sign Language, some of those adverbial expressions happen on the face or on the body. I mean, there's like this, you may not be able to see it, but there's a little twitch that happens here. It's facial grammar. It's an adverbial expression. I'll read, how many do we have time for?
Let's keep going, that's fine.
Maybe one or two?
Two, certainly.
Two, you think? Okay, yeah. So how about the verb in the matter? The verb in the matter. The astrophysicists surmise it is there by the behavior of planets around it. It's massive. It's dark. It may, after all, be the most of the stuff we're made of. They chose a noun to name it, but it's really the action of the matter that matters, that causes a stir, that sends us searching galaxy upon galaxy beyond ourselves. Like that thing called grace that's said to result from sacraments. Like the way color, when it strikes our eye after bouncing off thick pigments of a Van Gogh or Matisse, causes a lift in the heart, expands the diaphragm, grows molecules into our lungs that go riding through the chutes of our arteries, out into the tributaries of our bodies. That's what we are looking for, a verb that moves us and the planet we straddle. And then I'll do one more, and this is actually adverbial. Now then, a moment of hesitation before life moves either forward or backward, like a dandelion in full halo just before the wind catches and scatters the pappy. each fine hair drifting forward while the bracts curl backward, like the period ending a sentence before the next one dares to begin. Now then, the adult may say, what do you want to be when you grow up? To a child who, until that moment, was unaware that growing up is mandatory and that others will hold you to it. So,
Thank you.
thank you.